Economics, Unit 5, Macroeconomics, the nation's economy. In this unit, you will read to find out what statistics measure the economy's health, how the American banking system works, and the role of government in the economy. Our unit overview. The 5 chapters of Unit 5 explain how the nation's economy is managed. Chapter 13 describes and explains measures of economic performance. Chapter 14 describes the characteristics of money and explains how the banking system works. Chapter 15 explains the workings of the Federal Reserve System. Chapter 16 describes and explains how the government collects, spends, and owes money. Chapter 17 discusses the actions that government takes to fight unemployment and inflation. Our unit objectives are to explain how to measure economic performance, discuss the Federal Reserve System and United States monetary policy, and list methods used to fight unemployment and inflation. Chapter 13, Measuring the Performance of the Nation's Economy. Why it's important. Inflation, GDP, the Consumer Price Index. What do these headlines mean? This chapter will explain what these terms indicate about the state of the economy. When Hurricane Andrew blew through southern Florida, it was a disaster, but the GDP recorded it as a $15 billion boom to the economy. What does GDP measure? Under what circumstances would the labor of preparing a meal be included in GDP? People can measure how successful they are economically by the amount of their incomes and by their standard of living, including how much their spendable income will buy. In this section, you'll learn that the success of the overall economy is measured in a similar way. National income accounting. The measurement of the nation's economy, or the national economy's performance, is called the national income accounting. 5 major statistics measure the national economy: gross domestic product, net domestic product, national income, personal income, and disposable personal income. So here you can see the GDP and its components. So over on the left, you've got your gross domestic product. If you subtract out depreciation, you end up with the net domestic product. Then, minus indirect business taxes, that equals the national income. Then, you want to subtract out corporate taxes, reinvested profits, employer social security contributions, plus government and business transfer payments, and that equals the personal income. Then you want to subtract out personal taxes, and that will leave you with disposable personal income. Now let's look a little bit more at what all this means. Measuring gross domestic product. GDP is the total dollar value of all final goods produced in a country during a year. The GDP value is always expressed in dollars, and the GDP only accounts for final products so that parts are not double counted. For example, if you take a look at, let's say, a part for a car, let's say hypothetically a wheel. Okay, well, if the wheel is sold directly to a consumer as an end product, where it's a final product, it counts there. But wheels that are going to be sold to go directly onto brand new cars that are being sold brand new, those aren't counted. Only the sale of the car itself, the completed car. You don't count all the parts that go into it because you don't want to double count them. They count once. Also, only new products are counted. Used products are not, because they're considered to be a transfer from one owner to another. Once again, if you think in terms of a car, If somebody owns a car and they sell it to somebody else, that doesn't account for new production in the economy. It's simply a transfer from one owner to another. New car sales, though, does reflect actual production. GDP is computed by adding products purchased by consumers, by businesses, and by the government, as well as net exports, which is the difference between exports and imports. Some weaknesses. Some of the figures used to compute GDP are estimates, and it omits some areas of the economy. For example, there's a whole underground economy. If you know anybody that gets paid under the table, their income isn't really going to be reported, or people sometimes that underreport their income. Or another example, anybody that's involved in any type of illegal activity that involves monetary transactions. Hypothetically, so let's say drug dealers. Drug dealers are a real part of the economy because they do take money and then they will use, in exchange for the drugs that they sell, and they will turn around and may use that money to buy legal products. And it does affect the economy, but once again, they're not going to report that. At least if they're smart, they wouldn't be reporting that to the government. So things like that become really hard to measure. So we can't really count those types of transactions. And then another criticism is that it only measures quantity and not quality. Now here you can see a look at the four categories of GDP. Once again, to compute the GDP, economists add the total amount of expenditures from the consumer sector. So as these are things that are sold to the end consumers, people like you and me, as well as investment, which would mean business, goods, and services. Businesses buy stuff. So whatever businesses spend on goods or services, as well as the government. The government itself spends money on goods or services, and that would fall into another sector. And then you notice this last sector down here, net exports, and you see this is listed as a -%. Well, that's because in recent times we've been running a trade deficit, which means that we have a negative trade balance. We import more dollars worth of goods than we export. So our net exports, which is when you subtract the two, or it's the difference between our exports and our imports, we're importing more. Therefore, our net exports comes out to be a negative number. And so that will actually lower the GDP. Net domestic product. This accounts for the fact that some production is only due to depreciation. NDP takes GDP and subtracts the loss of value due to depreciation. NDP is a better measure of productivity because it accounts for depreciation. Measurements of income. The national income, once again, is the total earned by everybody in the economy. It is made up of wages and salaries, income of self-employed people, rental income, corporate profits, and interest on savings and other investments. Personal income is the income that is received before paying personal taxes. And then personal income, or PI, is the national income, or NI, minus transfer payments, which are assistance payments, and income that is not available to be spent. Disposable personal income, or DI, is the income that is left to purchase goods or put in savings after paying taxes. Now, in a previous unit, Unit 2, we looked at individuals and personal economics. And on an individual basis, you have the amount of income that you bring in as an individual after taxes. That's your disposable income. Here, we're looking basically at the disposable income of the nation, or of all of the people in the nation combined. That's what the DI really represents. In the 1970s, the primary goal of the Federal Reserve was to lower inflation. Interest rates went up, buttons were distributed that said WIN, an acronym for Whip Inflation Now. This was largely took place during the administration of Gerald Ford, who was the one that said we must whip inflation now. And this brings us to the question, what is inflation? And why is it considered harmful? And how does it skew GDP figures? GDP statistics measure the economy, but the GDP figures can be unreliable because they do not measure unpaid work or depreciation. Another factor that skews GDP figures is inflation, or a prolonged rise in the general price level of goods and services. The presence of inflation can pose a threat to the economy. In this section, you'll learn how inflation affects the current dollar value of GDP, as well as your ability to purchase goods and services. The purchasing power of money. When inflation occurs, the price of goods and services rise, and the purchasing price of the dollar goes down. Purchasing power of a dollar is equal to the real goods and services that the dollar can buy. Inflation can also be defined as the decline in the purchasing power of money. The faster the rate of inflation, the greater the drop in purchasing power. Inflation must be taken into account when calculating the GDP. Deflation is a prolonged decline in the general price level. Now, we truly rarely ever see deflation. We frequently see inflation, although it's been relatively low here lately. Looking at measures of inflation, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is a measure of the change in the price of a specific group of products and services, known as a market basket, that is used by the average household. So you think of the average types of products that that people are going to buy in the average household. Things like clothes, things like food, things like health care. These are basic products that people are going to buy. All those products would make up a market basket. And so if we look at, there's an overall rise in prices in those over a period of time. That's how they calculate the CPI. The Producer Price Index measures the average change in prices that companies charge the consumer. Most of the producer prices are in mining, manufacturing, and agriculture. The PPI usually rises before the CPI, and the GDP price deflator is used to remove the effects of inflation from a GDP so that different years can be compared in terms of spending value. For example, if you wanted to take the GDP figures from 1955 and compare them with 2015, I think overall the economy was a lot healthier in 1955 than it is in 2015. But just looking at raw GDP data, due to inflation, our GDP is going to be much, much higher. But when you actually compare, and adjust for inflation, that's another story. The figure achieved after the GDP price deflator is used is the real GDP. And here's a look at kind of what we're talking about. You talk about a market basket. You can look at average prices, and here they look at 3 years, 1999, 2000, 2001, for food, and you can see food prices went up a little bit every year. Clothing, that actually went down, and then housing went up, and so did medical. And then, anyway, when they calculate the CPI, you can see CPI figures for different years as well, going up between 1991 and 2001. Now here's a look at looking between 1990 and 2001 at GDP figures. This red line here, this marks the actual GDP without adjusting it. This is the real GDP chained in 1996 dollars. So they've applied the the price deflator and adjusted. And as you can see, the GDP went up quite a bit, but not as dramatically in the real GDP when you adjust for inflation. The laws of supply and demand can be applied to the economy as a whole, as well as to the individual consumer decisions. Economists are interested in the demand by all consumers for all goods and services, and the supply by all producers of all products and services. When we look at the economy as a whole in this way, we are looking at aggregates, the summing up of the individual parts in the economy. In this section, you'll learn that we call these sums aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The Institute for the Future is a marketing firm that predicts trends in consumer demand. They are specifically interested in sophisticated customers, which they define as having 3 of the 4 following characteristics. 1 year of college. 2, works as a manager, professional, or technician in an information-intensive job. 3, lives in a household with spending power of more than $50,000. And 4, has access to high-speed interactive multimedia communication devices at home. Sophisticated consumers accounted for 20% of all households in 1980, 45% in 1999, and are expected to reach 60% by the year 2020. How might the above changes in demographics impact aggregate demand and supply curves? So let's look at aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total quantity of goods and services demanded by all people in the economy. So unlike demand for a specific product, we're looking at the economy as a whole. What is the demand for all goods and services combined? Aggregate demand is related to the price level, or the average of all prices, as measured by a price index. If the price level goes down, a larger quantity of real domestic output is demanded per year. The relationship on the aggregate demand curve occurs because of the effect of inflation on the purchasing power of cash and the relative price of goods and services sold to other countries. So here's a look at the aggregate demand curve. Although the curve for aggregate demand resembles that for simple demand, it is for the entire economy, not just for one good or service. Aggregate demand may increase, in other words, the curve shifts to the right if consumers collectively spend more and save less, or if better economic conditions are forecast. Aggregate demand may decrease, the curve shifts to the left, if higher taxes are imposed on the overall economy, or if bleak economic conditions are forecast. Aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is the quantity of all goods and services being produced. If the price goes up and wages do not, overall profits will rise and producers will want to supply more. Here's a look at the aggregate supply curve. Similar to the individual supply curve, the aggregate supply curve shows that the amount of real GDP that could be produced at various price levels. Aggregate supply increases as the curve shifts to the right when all firms experience lower cost of production due to lower taxes or interest rates or lower prices for foreign oil, for example. The aggregate supply curve decreases or shifts to the left for the opposite reasons: higher taxes, higher interest rates, higher prices for foreign oil. Why is there an inverse relationship between aggregate quantity demanded and the price level? What causes the aggregate supply curve to slope upward? Putting aggregate demand and aggregate supply together. If you combine the aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve, you can find the equilibrium price and quantity where the two curves meet. just like we saw before with the other regular individual supply curve or demand curve. So the equilibrium price level is seen here. That's really marked by point E. The intersection of the aggregate demand and supply gives the equilibrium price level, and the national output, or real domestic product. Some years inflation is high and other years it is not. The same holds true for unemployment, world trade, and taxes. We have fluctuations in virtually all aspects of our economy. The ups and downs in an economy are called business fluctuations. Some people associate these ups and downs in business activity with what has been called the business cycle, the irregular changes in the level of total output measured by real GDP. In 1998, Jacob M. Schlesinger, an economics reporter for the Wall Street Journal, wrote, "Through the mid-1990s, pundits like to talk of America's perfectly balanced Goldilocks economy. Like the porridge that the girl of fable devoured, it was not too hot and not too cold, but just right. The boom, it seemed, would never end." What is a boom in the business cycle? And how do business fluctuations affect the real GDP? The model of the business cycle. It begins with growth that leads to an economic peak or boom or period of prosperity. Real GDP levels off and begins to decline while business activity slows down. This is known as a contraction. If real GDP doesn't grow for at least 6 months, the economy is in a recession. In other words, business activity falls at a rapid rate. Now, that's the official definition of a recession: 2 consecutive quarters, which would be 6 months, of negative economic growth, meaning the economy is not growing, but rather it's shrinking, or GDP is going down. If the recession continues to get worse, the economy goes into a depression, which is nothing more than a severe, prolonged recession. The downward direction of the economy levels off in a trough, which is the lowest point in the cycle, and then the real GDP stops going down. Business activity increases and the economy begins expansion or recovery. And so you can see here, it would look a lot like a roller coaster. During times of expansion or recovery, the economy sees growth. Eventually, it's going to hit a peak during the boom time of prosperity before it begins a contraction or a recession, where the economy slows down. When it hits the lowest point, it hits a trough, and that's where it kind of levels off. So it's the exact opposite of the peak. And then it will begin, once again, expansion or recovery, another period of growth, headed to the next peak or boom, followed by another slowdown, and it just kind of repeats this cycle. So once again, what are the phases of a typical business cycle? Well, once again, you have expansion or recovery leading to the peak or boom, followed by a contraction or a recession, headed to the low point, which is the trough, then back into expansion and recovery, back to a peak or boom, back to a constant contraction or recession. The ups and downs of business. In the real world economy, business cycles are not regular. The largest drop in the U.S. economy was following the stock market crash of 1929, which resulted in a severe depression. The rise climaxed after World War II. In the 1970s and 1980s, the economy had small recessions. The 1990s began with a recession, but became a time of great economic growth. And here you can see a look starting back in the 1880s. So the blue areas here are areas that we would say were areas where you hit recessions. And of course you can see this right here The secondary post-war depression, also known as really the Great Depression, hits in here in the mid-30s. And then, of course, up here at the top, these are your periods of growth heading to the peaks. For as long as booms and recessions have existed, economists have tried to explain why business fluctuations occur. If they could understand the causes, they reason, then the government could take actions to smooth out the business fluctuations. No single theory, however, seems to explain past cycles or serve as an adequate measure to predict future ones. The difficulty arises because at any given time, several factors are working together to create business fluctuations. Business cycles are difficult for economists to explain, but Jeffrey A. Miron, author of The Economics of Seasonal Cycles, says that they might be better understood if we looked more closely at seasonal fluctuations. Since the 1930s, macroeconomists have largely focused on business cycles. However, Miron suggests that seasons have business cycles that are driven by similar economic mechanisms and raise many of the same questions for welfare and policy analysis. Why is it difficult to explain business fluctuations? What might it mean to a nation's economy if business fluctuations were more fully understood? Causes of business fluctuations. Business investment. Companies expanding or scaling back, or companies using innovations in their business practices. Government activity. Taxing and spending policies and control of the money supply in the economy. External factors. Non-economy related factors such as wars or raw material cost. Psychological factors. People's optimistic or pessimistic outlook on the future and economy can contribute to increased spending or more saving. For example, during the course of a recession, one of the worst things that the government has to fear is that people become scared and quit spending money, because that causes the economy to slow down more. So if people try to hang on to their money and save more rather than spend, it can cause a slowdown in the economy and make a recession worse. What are some of the potential causes of business fluctuations? Well, once again, to review, we saw business investment, government activity, external factors, and psychological factors. Economic indicators. Economists in the government create forecasts to try and aid in predicting the future of the economy, and they are usually too broad to be helpful. Economists then turn to indicators to help predict the economy more accurately. Often different indicators within a group move in opposite directions. It can take a long time before a change in an indicator is felt in the economy. Leading indicators seem to lead to a change in overall business activity. Coincident indicators change at the same time as the economy changes, and lagging indicators change after the economic change has already begun and help the economist to determine how drastic and long-lasting this economic phase will be.